So tell me, do you think you know what is hip? Is it really clear? The past 10 years will show me into a good grim. Maybe you really am. What is...
Oh, we're here.
Good evening. Good evening. Good morning.
Good evening to you. Good morning here.
How are you, Tarik? Are you well?
I'm very well here. Are you in Amsterdam?
I'm well enough. I wish they would get these vaccines rolled out over here, but you're doing a lot better than we are over here now. But it's great to see you again for episode 5.
Episode 5.
I know.
Yeah.
We're trogging along. So that's great. And no, this is our first after your inauguration in the last show. So no, I'm looking forward to carrying on these mad events with all these wonderful people.
Yes, we've got a really actually amazing guest coming to join us. One of the great composers around today, Pulitzer Prize winner, fabulous educator as well, and an all-round wonderfully committed person to new music and music in general, and indeed, as I suspect we'll find out, earlier music as well. So please come into the virtual environment. Aaron Jay Kernis, are you there?
Oh, yeah, there he is. Welcome, Aaron. How are you?
Good, I'm good. Great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. It's really nice to have you on the show.
I'm sorry I'm not there. I'd like to be in all the places that you are. I'm a little sick of New York at this point, having not been able to leave here for a long time.
You're in New York right now?
Yeah.
And how is it there?
It's, it's becoming spring, except for today when it's 30 again. But in general, it's been becoming quite lovely.
And have you been there throughout this strange year we've just had of pandemia?
I've been here exclusively, except for last summer when I spent about a month and a half in the Bay Area. Other than that, I have not left at all, which is, what we're all going through in our own way. And I'd rather still not fly. I'd rather wait, even with the vaccine. But that I'm sure will change soon, because now that I'm fully vaccinated and soon it's going to be time to get out of here. It's
nice to see you, Aaron. And it's obviously you've got a connection to this area.
It's really been since 1979. I mean, my first year of school, I decided that I had to get away from my parents and had to rush away from the East Coast. And so I took a year at the San Francisco Conservatory, and actually at that point, which was before, this really early point in John Adams' career, I worked with him for that year, just before he started working with the symphony. And I've maintained all those years. My dearest best friend is David Tannenbaum, great guitar player and head of the guitar faculty there. So I've just maintained this connection to the conservatory and worked with the symphony for a while. And now my wife and I have a house in Mill Valley that we come back to for summers. And it's just, a continuous, part of my life.
And there's obviously a sort of a connection now, and I don't know how long it's been with PBO, but there
a great new aspect of kind of continued connection to the area, which I'm delighted about.
And which is that PBO has commissioned a work from you, and this is looked very exciting from what I can see, and I wonder whether you might, if you're able to, if there's not some veil of secrecy over it.
No embargo.
Tell us a little about it, because I think it was in the works before I came along, so I'm extremely excited to know a little more about it.
Yeah, so it's a joint commission with PBO and the Yale School of Cantorium that are joining forces with the Juilliard 415 period orchestra. And I've been teaching at Yale for about 18 years. And, you know, the head of choral activities, you know, approached me about 2 years ago, asked about this. And so I immediately wanted to work with my colleague, Peter Cole. And Peter and I actually go back to probably first having met in San Francisco and then in Jerusalem. But Peter is an amazing poet and a translator. He's a MacArthur winner, and he's currently in the Judaic Studies program at Yale. And so he wrote this gorgeous text related to Eden and the garden, and the earth as the garden that we have to, you know, respect and guard and take care of. So it's really related to issues of, you know, what we're facing now with warming and global issues. But there's also actually in maybe the most dramatic part of the text, there are references to paradise, and not just the paradise of Eden, but the paradise fires, because the fires are the most dramatic part and the darkest part of the text. So there are five movements, and the first begins with the idea of Eden as paradise, and near the end we have the idea of paradise as burning. So it's just gorgeous text, and it really touches on in very poetic and very philosophical ways this sense of the garden as our earth, as our home, and what we really need to take good care of.
And is this, well, first of all, how long is the piece? What's the scope of the piece? Because those are...
Yeah, they're big issues, yeah. It's a good question. I'm still figuring that out, but I assume it's in the 30-35 minute range, probably. Yeah, and it's the kind of singer situation where soloists come from the choir, you know, fairly frequently and fade back in. And yeah, but it's obviously as a kind of oratorio, it's got a really significant choral part. And but certainly the really what's been the challenging and illuminating part of the process was I was initially having conversations with pretty much every musicians in every instrument group who were teachers at Juilliard, and some of whom are members of the PBO, about their instruments, about the special characteristics of them, and things to watch out for, all those kind of things. And of course, whenever I approach the horn parts, I just kind of freak out and have to watch my back all the time. But
I don't think you should be too nice to them about. I think, you know, it's quite interesting. You can do quite a lot on early horns.
Oh yeah, I'm not nice to them. That's not.
That's good. That's okay.
It's that I keep on like looking over my shoulder, thinking, okay, do I have time to change the horn in G and then the horn E and all the crooks and you know, the most challenging thing is, even though I'm mostly a tonal composer, but I don't write, my keys change really rapidly. And the orientation of the people I was speaking to was always, of course, about keys. And I just, at a certain point, realized, you know, I can't kowtow to that. I just have to write what I need to write and watch out for, you know, for tricky elements, but not be too constricted either.
We were just saying this last week that for me personally as a composer, some of the great, in a sense, composition lessons have come from players. And it's, I don't know what it is specifically, but it's something about the physical repertoire that they hold in their hands and in their minds. And there's something that one learns from a player that is more than just these technical decisions. But in my mind, I always find it both very mind-opening and then terrifying when you start speaking.
True.
You know, very specific players. And I know your work well. I should say a big fan of it.
Thank you.
And I know that in other works of yours, you've touched on earlier forms, certainly,
Yes.
and influences from a broad range of historic era. And that, in my mind, feels somewhat different to actually writing for period instrument. Is this the first time you've written specifically for early instruments rather than it is?
Yes, and I mean there have been cases, and there are a couple of cases I'll play some little excerpts of where I'm actually seeking to emulate the sound of early, sound of a consort of viols or sound of a period string instruments, especially because it's a sound, it's a world of music and thought that I've loved for all these years.
Play us something, as you've mentioned.
Great, yeah.
I'd love to hear that.
Well, I think the thing I'd like to start with, a kind of obvious piece of mine I'd like to start with is a little excerpt from my piece Musica Celestis, which directly comes out from inspiration from Hildegard, music of Hildegard of Bingen, and seeks to find the kind of heavenly sonority through purity of the strings. And the performance I'll play, and this is probably of all my pieces, it's gone around the world more than any other. But this performance is a really gorgeous one by the Trondheim soloists that was recorded in a beautiful church in Norway and done with, and you can't tell this from a YouTube, MP3 sounding recording, but it was recorded with absolutely the highest level of surround sound possible, and the strings were seated in a circle, and it's just a gorgeous recording. So I'll just play a little bit of the opening of the piece Musica Celestis. So I think that gives you and from there on, really, it's a series of variations. The variations get more and more kind of busy, and they gradually, the melody goes more and more, disappears, and you're left with rising scales, because the idea musica celestis is the singing of angels in heaven ceaselessly, and this idea of constantly rising, as well as based on this lyrical tune, is really what animates the piece.
It's utterly ravishing music, really, and wonderful, wonderful.
It's gorgeous, and I think the idea of, yes, the musica celestis also, it feels it's something that has touched on composers throughout so many generations, that it feels sort of, there's a self-referential to it in the way, also in the way that it's spiraling. There's a self-reference, I feel, with the way that, you know, composers of earlier generations have always felt this draw to the music of the spheres, or some kind of mathematical organicism that sort of links the resonance, the resonance of, you know, the universe with the resonance of.
Very much so. Yeah. Initially, it was my intention. I mean, I having read about Hildegard and reading about medieval theory and finding these definitions from medieval theorists of music celestis and music instrumentalis and music of the spheres and all this, the intention, I was going to write, you know, 4 string quartets with different, these different elements. I got to 2 because the second string quartet is called Musica Instrumentalis, and Music Celestis began its life as a string quartet and then became string orchestra music. And I still haven't quite been able to crack the music of the spheres.
Yeah.
One hopes to keep trying. Actually, I did in my 4th string quartet, which hasn't been recorded yet. I wanted to do something a bit different, and so I created 32 tracks of string sound along with the string quartet to create this very otherworldly surrounding of kind of like a music of the spheres in a way. That's the closest I've come.
Wow. I was going to ask you the next question, but I thought it'd be fun to ask Richard. Or ask myself. But why do we, as composers living now, why do we keep going back? What is it that, why do we keep feeling drawn either to prior actual works or prior eras or prior ways of doing things or prior genres or prior forms? What is it? I feel it's something that composers have always done, but I find it very hard to, and I am drawn to it myself. And obviously, you know, Aaron, you're talking very eloquently about your connections, but why? Why do we do this?
There is something basic about the ideas of harmony. I mean, it's just a part of the natural universe. I mean, the harmonic, you know, the natural harmonic series talking about natural horns, and trying to get back to a basic understanding of what sound is about and how it resonates and how it's always resonated. And even the music of the spheres thing. I mean, even Bach, if you believe some theories, had a go at trying to deal with that in the third Brandenburg with the spinning motif of the third movement of Brandenburg 3, which spans one of the intervals which is in Kepler's discussion of music of the spheres. I mean, so it's just, you know, that sort of primal fascination with what is sound, what is music, is, I think that's just something which is always with musicians and people that are involved in music.
I think something that has intensified it, or at least early on intensified it, was how decidedly negative composers in the middle of the century, of last century, were to avoid it entirely.
Yeah.
And so that created a very strong kind of schism almost of who were you with? Were you with the past or were you with today? And I think, you know, certainly one of the great beauties of the period instrument movement has been to find not, you know, a lot of music that we didn't know and music that we did know, and make it sound so utterly fresh and so utterly new that there stops being an issue between historicism and you know, what is only in effect kind of ultra-modernism in effect, or just only what's today.
That's fantastic you say that, because that's one of the threads of our show, is to sort of try and draw together these connections and show that there is a huge connection between what the old music world is doing and what new music is. It's there's not really a distance problem. We're actually trying to achieve the same thing.
Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. And I think, Aaron, you've also, you know, echoing what Richard's saying, this idea of sort of going back to an earlier attitude as well. It's not just the notes, but this sort of freshness and exploratory sense. And so I feel we keep coming around to this idea of composing being very connected to performance, and how you know, I feel there's a greater connection. I mean, it's not that composers have to be performers themselves, but a greater connection between drawing in the strands of being a performer and being a composer is sort of connected through a broader musicianship. And I feel that when you talk about the sort of middle of the 20th century and going back from, I feel that from there and a bit before was that I felt some of the damage in a sense that was done was this splitting off of the composer as an entirely independent, separate entity that is in some way utterly disconnected from the other things that one does musically, whether it's improvise or perform or conduct or play. And
even though in a way, you know, that separation feels like it started with Beethoven in a way.
Yeah,
it's the seeds of it. Yet that was also, you know, right kind of smack in the middle of the composer as performer, and you know, of course, continuing to Chopin, Schumann, et cetera, Mahler. But I agree completely. And what's been so heartening is that such a high percentage of the students that I work with and see are also performers and are also very connected to performing in some way.
Yeah, it feels, in general, I would say it feels like a very good period. It feels like a very positive period, actually, specifically because of that.
And I think it's this massive schism and this sort of desert of disconnection, if you like, gives rise to a lot of the sort of reviewing and criticism. I always smile because I read that you're described as a neo-romantic or a post-romantic. What the hell does that mean? It's just bollock. Am I allowed to say bollocks? No, I'm not allowed to say bollocks. Cut that, Miles. What does it mean? I mean, saying he's a composer who wants to elicit emotion in his list. Doesn't any real composer want to elicit emotion through their music?
These labels are totally ridiculous,
yeah,
and
exactly.
I agree completely. And they are basically meaningless at this point. You know, you know, following up on what we were talking about history and influences and all that, I think this might be a good time. I'd like to play another excerpt of a much more recent piece, because Musica Celestis comes from 1990-91, and very recently, maybe about 2-3 years ago, I wrote my Fourth Symphony, and part of the Fourth Symphony, I became inspired in a way by Handel's aria Lascia Piango, sorry, excuse me, and basically wrote sort of a series of variations in a way on it, but they go, it's almost as if and I present it with a quartet playing without vibrato, kind of trying to sound like a period group. And then very quickly, there's an overlay of almost kind of Ivesian kind of way of thinking and the idea ultimately is of multiple historical layering over this thing that is from quite long ago. What I'm going to play actually completely leaves out the opening, which is very full of, it's the entire orchestra just going wild. And then that kind of disappears and you're left with the string quartet, bringing us back to a kind of sense of purity, which is then very quickly thrown out the window again. So this is a little bit of this movement, which I called Thorn, Rose, Weep, Freedom after Handel. And the reason it's called Thorn, Rose, Weep, Freedom is Handel knew he had a great hit on his hands with this aria. And I think there were at least three versions with three different libretti. And so those are four of the keywords from two different settings that he did. And at that time, so deep in the middle of what we just are hopefully getting out of in the Trump years, those words spoke to me about trying to move back into a sense of freedom, which I felt was lost during that period very much. So there's a little sense of that in the movement as well. So I think that gives a sense of this kind of micro mini variations. They have some are different, very different lengths, but they go by very quickly. And a little later, there's some kind of jazzy references and things like that. But there's a sense of really this overlay on top of the purity of the original, and then taking little strands of it and using that as a springboard for variation.
I love it. I love this. It feels like this sort of discussion between the contiguous and the concurrent. Like it's not this, but there's a sort of concurrent sense of varying at the same time, and it's sort of deconstruction in real time. It feels and it also feels very alive, which I love.
Thank you.
It's absolutely amazing to hear it. How do you feel about going back to, I mean, if you think of, I suppose, if you think of variation as a form in its own right, I mean, I think that's the other thing that I often think about with these, thinking back to earlier periods, you know, these, for example, dance forms that I know that you've worked, I think we've all worked with, but it's not just, for me, it's not just harmony and tonality, and again, we've been talking about the attitudes of it all, but these sort of, the evolution of these quite distinct forms that have stayed with us in some ways, and like, you know, what you're doing with this, the work you just played, I feel contemporary composers also investigate form, sort of, I don't know if you can speak to that, or if there's some or if you think I'm just talking.
No, that's a big question. It's hard to know where to start with that, because certainly for me, no matter you know, if I'm looking for kind of formal cues from the past, I'm kind of always wanting to pull out different things from them and overlay them, distort them, not kind of lead them in different directions than they were in the past. So they're really, as I used before, the word springboard is really, really important. And certainly variation, I spent a good, actually, I mean, Musica Celestis back from 91 was my first set of variations. And I left that for, you know, I didn't want to touch that before, because I felt that the variation form had become so ossified and so strictly controlled, except for a couple of important pieces in the 20th century, the Carter variations, the Schoenberg variations, some other ones that were more about developing from the get-go, not using constrictions from it has to go through all the harmonies that you've been through in the original and the same kind of phrase structure and the same kind of length roughly. And just wanting to move toward this idea of developing variations, constant development, constant freshness in the discourse. And that's what I did for quite a number of years, because I was always interested in how am I going to develop these ideas? It was always a mystery, always always this question of like sitting down with a tabula rasa every day and saying, what's development? How do I deal with this? How do I extend my ideas? And older work gives great clues to that and great solutions from all over the history of music, but also gives cues as to what to do next and what to try.
I think that's true of composers even in earlier times. I mean, the great composers have always taken well-known forms and tried to find something new. I mean, just take, for instance, Haydn, any of his minuets. You can't dance them. They're impossible to dance because he messes around. He can't resist messing around with phrase structure, and so I think that's a great lesson from history that absolutely is something that can be used today.
And of course, going back to the just years and years of music based on chorales and based on cantus firmi and all that, always about variation, about layering and about change and keeping continuity, and yet creating a great sense of change and freedom above that. So it's really been with us pretty much from the beginning.
I certainly find that in a sense, this idea of springboarding, as you put it, or deconstruction, or working out ways in which to evolve, for my mind, feels like in the most positive sense, it's some sort of restricting nature of getting away from as you put it, the tabula rasa, which I find the most terrifying thing of all, which is to just a completely blank slate, write this piece. It's horrible.
Every new piece that unless you have some ideas going in, until that starts to form itself, that sense of emptiness of just nothing, and you have to create something continues. It's never easy, and it's never and that sense of starting again never goes away.
Yeah, exactly. And I find these sort of aesthetic puzzles and games and sort of historical viewing for me, it begins to help, even if they can be terrifying, the variation or looking back to Bach, which is terrifying in its own right. It just feels like it's a granule. It's something that there's a spot of something on the blank page that isn't, completely blank. But I was thinking of, the sort of connected to that, the the more sort of practical restrictions. And I was thinking of your work. Is it concerto with echoes or for echo? With echoes.
With concerto, I always forget, in echoes or with echoes. It's with echoes, yeah. I struggled over that for a long time.
Over the writing of it, or the title?
Of the title and the writing.
And this is the one that is in some, well, it's part of that larger project of new works connected to the Brandenburg.
That's right. Yeah, it was related to Brandenburg 6.
So it doesn't have violins.
Sorry?
It doesn't have, your work.
That's right. It doesn't have violins, but I decided that, you know, halfway through the piece, I was going to start bringing in winds, and I was going to start bringing the winds of the Brandenburg 1 with a little percussion to just kind of suddenly, because the first movement is only strings, and the second movement starts only with strings, but then gradually these things start to find their way in. I don't have an excerpt of that with me today, but certainly it was a total joy to really not just listen and love the Brandenburgs, which I had for, you know, one of the first series of Bach pieces I ever heard, but just to kind of grapple with some of the structural impacts of those movements, and, you know, what great pieces. So,
yeah, I love your work, and whenever I've worked with that type of commission where there's a practical consideration at least, because it's somehow connected to something earlier, whether that it's something that's going to be paired on the program or it's part of an ongoing programming idea. I've always loved it. I've always loved having the little puzzle to overcome, or the little, well, you know, we're pairing it with this piece, so that ideally it would be a matching orchestration or something like that.
Yeah.
Whether you choose to ignore it, you know, is it something? But yeah.
Related to that, and what you were saying about dance forms also, I'd like to play the next excerpt, actually. Part of a cello and piano suite that I wrote, and it's actually kind of constructed in a lot of ways as a dance suite, but a dance suite based on jazz, based on various styles of jazz. And I wrote it jointly for my son Jonah, who's a cellist, and for him and I to play, and for Matt Heimovitz and Andrea Lamb, who did this wonderful recording. And throughout the piece, there are all sorts of references. The whole idea was, it's called First Club Date. And the whole idea was, I was writing a piece for my son to discover the whole range of jazz styles, and imagine what would a young cellist who had to play his first club date have to know to play jazz in a club. And so it really has a very historical, you know, a lot of different touches of great jazz artists. And this movement is called Puppy Love. The reason it's called Puppy Love is my son's favorite progressive jazz group is Snarky Puppy.
Right.
And one of their founders is the bass player. And so much of their music is based on bass lines and riffs, and particularly, like, always there's that fundamental ongoing bass line. So in this movement, that's really where it starts. It starts with the bass line, and then that bass line recurs and varies along with other variations on top of it. Yeah, I gave my son a lot to do, you know, and he's a wonderful young cellist. He's doing great and just about to go off to college. We don't know quite where yet, with conservatory, but he's a cellist. And Matt Heimovitz, you know, who played, and Andrew are amazing. So
I love it. It's
really fun. Really
it's
fun.
really the idea of a Passacaglia. I mean, that's basically it keeps on being varied. So
right, yeah. It's so energetic and forward moving. It's brilliant, and what a lovely personal connection as well.
Yeah.
I do want to mention one other thing, and particular to Richard, that because you live in Amsterdam, and I briefly I was fortunate to have a Rome Prize in the mid '80s, and from Rome I moved to spend a little time in London, moved to Amsterdam for about 6 months, and one of the absolutely revelatory experiences I had in Amsterdam, which changed my whole thinking, particularly about Beethoven, but was really my entree actually orally into the period instrument movement, was hearing the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment with Franz Bruggen do the Eroica. And before that point, I could not really connect to Beethoven. I could not make sense of these heavy, you know, ultra kind of romantic, slow performances that were the norm in traditional orchestras. And that performance just completely, you know, the scales fell from my eyes, whatever, and just opened up a whole new world. And since that time, listening to period groups and paying good attention to these, you know, more recently excavated styles of playing have been really, really important in my education and my life. So
Franz was a notorious sort of trooper and antagonist and fighter in the 70s and 80s, and you know, he would basically sort of go and picket outside the artist entrance at the Concertgebouw, and as the orchestra members were going, "What you're doing in there is absolutely rubbish," you know, this kind of and yeah, this was a great city for that kind of provocation and reassessment of what was going on at that time. And he was an amazing pioneer, and yeah, very special conductor. I mean, as a very special musician. Every orchestra I heard him conduct, whether it was the OAE or his, you know, the orchestra of the 18th century, or he carried his sound with him, and that's always the mark of a good conductor or a good musician. They have something in them which, when they're in front of a group of people, somehow that you hear that. It's like that famous story of that. There's some videos on the art of conducting, and there's a story told by the timpani player of the Berlin Philharmonic when Furtwängler was still conducting the orchestra, and he said that the orchestra was playing for somebody. It wasn't Furtwängler, and he was sitting at the timpani reading the score, and suddenly the sound of the orchestra completely changed, and he just looked up and he saw that Furtwängler was in the corner of the room, and just because the orchestra had noticed that he was in the room, they just started playing differently and feeling the whole thing differently. And that was something that Bruggen had. He really carried a sound with him, and an idea of music and what it's about.
With you and your colleagues, Richard, when you're working with earlier repertoire in informed fashion, I mean, are you aware? Because I think what Aaron speaks to is there is a real interest in what you do from contemporary composers, you and your colleagues. It is a very real, tangible catalyst for many composers. And this is not new music for old instruments. I mean, the new ways that you're inhabiting earlier works it sounds like a very basic question, but is that known? Do you know that? I think
influencers. I think so. I mean, yeah, I think there are, yes, I would say that the people in the hip world, my hip world, are aware that it's had a big impact on a lot of composers since the 50s and 60s. Yes, I think so. I think it's great. And as I say, it just sort of enhances this connection that we're talking about. I mean, it's, yeah, and it should be a big part of what we're doing. That's why we've started this real commitment to play new music, or play music written by people who are alive.
I always think those resonances are very, very strong. You know, whether it's even stuff just happening in the same place. I often think of, you know, Stravinsky living in Los Angeles, and not that he was particularly involved in the film world, but just I think the resonances of, one feels the resonances of his being there in, you know, way that film scores begin to evolve during that period that he's there. And it's sort of, there's something in these worlds that you think shouldn't necessarily connect. There is something there that just feels sort of in the air and magical. So I'm glad to hear. Do you have one more piece for us?
Yeah, so let me lead out with a little bit of the last movement of my violin concerto, which is called a Toccatini. And the idea was that if I had to create a drink, a new martini, it would be Toccatini. And in fact, I thought, you know, at the premiere, this would be something they could offer at the bar. Excellent. Instead of a Saccatini and all that, a Toccatini. So anyway, it has that kind of moto perpetuo aspect, and it's a fantastic performance with the brilliant James Ennis and Seattle Symphony and Ludovic Morlot. since you mentioned Stravinsky. A little bit of that, and a little bit of I love Messiaen, so that's
yeah.
strong influence.
Fantastic.
It's so refreshing to hear, and connects with the way that you talk, Richard, as well. It's just so refreshing to hear composers talk of other composers as influences, and very openly so, because it's something that it's something that you hear in all other genres. If you go and hear rock bands talk about how a song came about, they'll often say, well, this other band was doing really interesting and we wanted a bit of this, and I've always been influenced by that. And it is much rarer, I really do say that for contemporary concert composers, however you want to call us, to be so open with regard to influence of either other living composers or near living composers. And so it's exceptionally refreshing to say that from the bottom.
Well, I guess it was just sort of taboo. You weren't supposed to do anything that could be sniffed as being derivative or influenced. That's what we were talking about when we started off. I mean, but there's nothing, surely it's a great thing to have all these things that you can draw on to enrich your own palettes, I would have thought.
Be inspired by, and
yeah.
I've always, kind of believed the, Stravinskian motto of, never borrow, always steal, that I steal, I never borrow.
Yes, yeah. Well, yeah, and I think it goes against this sort of, again, going back to the tabula rasa, to the clean slate. I mean, nothing ever comes from absolute zero. I mean, there's got to be something. So it's just been a joy, Aaron.
Yeah, same.
Thank you. Fantastic, Aaron.
And I can't wait to actually put the double bar on this and hand it to you, hopefully not too far from now.
Fantastic. Wonderful.
Can't wait.
Looking forward to that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be well, be safe.
Yeah, whatever. Thanks so much, everybody.
You too. We'll see you in person very soon, I hope.
Hope so.
Yeah. All right.
And bring on episode 6.
Bye, everyone.
What is hip? So tell me, do you think you know what is hip? If you really care, the past 10 years will show.